morning and welcome to Skipton Baptist Church Online. We're continuing our series on Practicing the Way based on John Mark Comer's book and related resources. And today we're going to be focusing on the practice of service. And Phil and I will be sharing the teaching input on this. We live in an age and culture which is consumed with self-interest and is dominated by consumerism and individualism. The message, not just being told to us, but forming us, is that we must look out for number one. Often our default setting is not to offer to serve others, but to expect to be served by them. And then we complain if people don't serve us in the way we expect they should. Many of us might carry a quiet guilt or shame for not doing enough to help others, but we're often not sure what to do about it. Or we seek to justify our lack of service by saying we're just too busy with our own lives to get involved in the lives of others. Yet Jesus, the Son of Man who came not to be served but to serve, invites us to follow him in radical service that moves us beyond ourselves and into love for others. And if it's Jesus we're apprenticing under, we too must seek to follow his example and learn how to serve others like he did. Service that follows compassion, surrendering our plans and expectations. Service that goes unseen in hidden places. Service that befriends those we perhaps thought we were above. And service that in love embraces a great cost to ourselves. John Mark Comer defines the practice of service as the expression of Christ-like love through meeting the practical needs of another, especially those most in need of help. And this can look like lots of different things. For example, it can be a parent putting their children's needs before their own, whether that involves getting up in the middle of the night to feed and change the young baby who's woken crying, or agreeing to play a lively game with their toddler, even all they really want to do is relax quietly on their own, or choosing to actively listen to their teenager who's having a challenging time, even though they're really busy with their own work and deadlines. Or it might involve making room in your diary to volunteer or help those in need in your community, whether that be travelling into Leeds or Bradford to help in a homeless shelter, stopping to talk to the big issue seller you see in the street on a cold day and offering to get them a hot drink, or helping out in your local food bank or wellbeing cafe, for example. Or it might be something much more obviously sacrificial and heroic, such as the LNEO staff member, Samir Zitouni, who bravely and selflessly served others by acting to protect passengers from the attacker on the Doncaster to London train last Saturday. These are all examples of service, of the expression of Christ-like love through meeting the practical needs of another. Something you might like to consider in your Connect groups is what, if anything, is the difference when such acts of loving service are performed by Christians as opposed to non-Christians. In this practice, we're exploring what it looks like to make serving others our way of being in the world, reflecting on the why, how, where and who in Jesus' vision of service. The practice of service involves being with Jesus among the needs of others, becoming like Jesus as we're shaped increasingly into his image by imitating his self-giving love, and doing as he did as we make his mission our own. But the thing is, this kind of service won't just happen in our me-centred, self-gratifying world. It requires regular practice. But if we say yes to Jesus' invitation to tune ourselves and attend to the needs of those around us, it has the potential to do a deep work, not just through us, but in us. Because as John Mark Comer puts it, not only does the practice of service have the potential to mend our fractured world, it has the power to mend us. So the first aspect of such service we're going to look at is love. In Matthew chapter 7, in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says to the crowds, "By their fruit you will recognise them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit." But there's more to it than that. Our acts of service, our good fruit, should be inspired by our love for God and for others, not just something we do because we feel we should. Again and again, Jesus criticised the Pharisees and teachers of the law for getting hung up on keeping the letter of the law rather than the spirit of the law. They were more interested in policing the Sabbath, for example, than responding to those in need. They were doing all the right things, keeping all the right practices, Sabbath, studying the scriptures, fasting, and so on. But for all the wrong reasons. Their hearts were not filled with love for others, but with religiosity. They'd become so focused on the how of spiritual formation that they'd lost track of the why. So instead of being fruitful, they were in fact becoming fruitless, despite their good intentions initially. In order to be truly fruitful, our actions need to reflect the love of God that's growing in our hearts. Jesus said the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind and strength, and that the second is to love your neighbour as yourself. For Jesus, love for God and love for others are inextricably linked. And the way we love others is directly connected to, even revealing of, the true state of our hearts towards God. For example, what's the point of reading the Bible every morning if it's not making us more like Jesus and we're not becoming kinder to our co-workers, friends and family as a result? Will we be better off just sleeping in? Or if we volunteer at church or a homeless shelter or in a charity shop as a means of appeasing our consciences and always complaining about the fact we're doing it, we might as well stay at home. Or if we pray morning, midday and evening, but it's not making us more empathetic friends or patient parents, we're missing the point. If practicing the way of Jesus isn't filling us to overflowing with the love of Jesus, although we might be ticking all the right boxes for living a religious life, we'll end up being out of tune with God's heart for us and his heart for those around us. The spiritual practices we've been learning about, whether that be solitude, fasting or Sabbath, are intended to free us to become people of love that is embodied, practical and self-sacrificial, just like we see in the life of Jesus. As Jesus says in John chapter 13, "As I have loved you, so you should love one another." Our lives of love towards others should be visible as first fruits, if you like, of the kingdom of God, of the new creation which Jesus gave us glimpses of, and is promised to come to its ultimate fulfillment and revelation when there will be a new heaven and a new earth. So how do we know if we're becoming people of love, of Jesus-like love, in interactions with others? Some possible questions to ask ourselves include: is the tone I use when speaking to my spouse, my friends or colleagues normally gentle or harsh? Am I open to being interrupted by my neighbours? Am I being patient towards my children or my parents? Do I show compassion to my co-workers? Or do I chip away at them with my constant criticism and judgmentalism? And what can we do to become more loving in our service of others? As with the rest of the practices we've looked at, the key thing is to start where we are, not where we want to be, and to start today, not tomorrow. Start with the people we live with or who we will see later today. Start with the people you speak to after the service at church. How can you get alongside someone else today and help them with their practical needs or sharing an emotional burden that they're carrying? Because if we start with the little things and do them regularly, the bigger things will follow. Researchers who interviewed over 700 individuals in an effort to discover what caused some non-Jewish Europeans to risk their lives by sheltering oppressed Jews during the Nazi occupation of mainland Europe in the Second World War, found that the distinguishing characteristic of those who sought to rescue Jews was the individual's practice of loving service to others in their ordinary relationships and everyday environments prior to the war. In other words, those most likely to serve in extraordinary ways when the pressure is on are those who practice service in ordinary everyday ways when the pressure is off. And this leads us on to the second aspect of service that we're looking at today, that of hiddenness. Serving others quietly in the ordinary environments of our everyday lives. Jesus served among the sick, the poor, the oppressed. He served at leper colonies and among others society had excluded, tax collectors, prostitutes and sinners. But perhaps his most striking act and invitation to service came at his own dinner table among the company of his closest companions, when on his final night between courses at the Passover dinner, he got down on his knees and washed his disciples' feet. Now, culturally speaking, there was no more menial, humiliating task than foot washing. According to rabbinical tradition, no Israelite person washed the feet of another. It was considered debased and degrading. Even a Jewish slave wasn't tasked with foot washing. Only Gentile slaves taken into Jewish households did that. Jesus didn't pick some blue-collar task even. He picked the most menial task reserved for the most humble, low-ranking member of the household. And he did it at Passover. At a Passover dinner, Jesus, a Jewish rabbi, did work considered unbecoming of any Jewish person at a sacred meal of preparation for a highly formal, strictly observed day of rest. And when he had finished, he said to his disciples, "I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you." Now, Jesus clearly didn't mean by this that we should all go about literally washing one another's feet. But such foot washing was one act of service, the expression of Christ-like love through meeting the practical needs of another. The point is that we have all freely received the love of Jesus ourselves, and so should respond by freely giving such love to others by meeting their practical needs. And significantly, Jesus didn't take his disciples to wash feet in a leper colony or among other social outcasts, but rather he chose to wash the feet of his closest followers, his friends, at his own table. And this turns the idea that service is something we should chiefly do outside our normal settings, away from our everyday relationships, on its head. But that's not to say we can't also serve others in different environments. Of course we can, and we should do that. But we are called to begin by loving and serving those we encounter in our ordinary everyday lives and relationships, whether that be our family, our work colleagues, or our friends at school, for example. But the truth is that many of us are better at doing projects of love than becoming people of love. It can be relatively easy for us to go somewhere different outside our normal daily life, to an external environment from it, and to set aside an hour or two to actively serve others. But the real challenge is, can we offer the same love and service to those we spend time with every day, day in and day out? Can we respond lovingly to our husband, wife, children, parents when we come home tired after a long and busy day? Can we offer them the same care and attention that we offer the people we've intentionally set out to serve in our external act of service? Can we offer that same care and attention to our work colleagues or school friends when we're busy with our own agenda, our own deadlines? Will we allow ourselves to be formed into people of love, into the people Jesus calls us to be, into his apprentices, through intentionally serving and loving those we interact with each day in the hidden duties of our daily life? Whether that be caring for young children or aged parents, mowing the lawn for our elderly neighbour, cooking dinner for our family, or helping our parents clear up afterwards. As we remember how Jesus humbly chose to wash his disciples' feet on the night he was betrayed. Will we allow the practice of service to enable us to live out the gospel in a tangible, embodied way among the people we encounter each day, empowered by Christ's love for us? Phil's now going to share about a couple of other aspects of the practice of service.
So when we talk about the practice of service or serving, maybe it's because I'm a child of the 70s or 80s, but sometimes my mind goes back to that classic sitcom, Are You Being Served? Perhaps you remember it. It had a distinctive cast and a very distinctive catchphrase, which would have been, "Are you free?" with the response, "I'm free." And the question is, free to do what? Well, clearly it was to serve the customer. But surprisingly, there is biblical precedent behind this that really could be a surprise. In Galatians 5:13, it says, "You, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free, but don't use your freedom to indulge the flesh. Rather, serve one another humbly in love. We are not slaves, we are free. But what do we do with that freedom? Do we take it for a personal spin? The answer is no. We are free to choose to serve and to serve one another. Serve one another is one of those 27 or so one another's that I mentioned last week when we looked at the previous practice. And this sense of serving one another, of mutual serving, is worth pausing on just for a moment, because it isn't that some are called to be those who serve in the church and others are those to be served. That doesn't grasp Jesus' kingdom. I serve you and I am served by you too. There's a mutuality to what Jesus is presenting. And to put this puts meat on the bones of the greatest commandment. In Matthew 22, 34 to 40, someone asks him, what is the greatest commandment? And Jesus says, it's love God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength, your whole person. But the depth and quality and evidence of how deep that love impacts you is demonstrated by your love for others as you are loved. And Catherine's already highlighted that sense of fruitfulness, that how we live and serve is a measure of God's love within us. In Luke's version of that interaction about the greatest commandment, the questioner doubles back on Jesus. And he says, well, from this, who is my neighbor? And I wonder if that question reveals something of our intrinsic human response to need a given method in living for Jesus. Tell me exactly who, where and when and what to do. So tell me who so I know who I don't have to serve. Tell me where and when so I know where I can relax and not be bothered. Tell me what so I get what I have to do and do that is all. What is the bare minimum to get where I want to go? Or is that too cynical or too honest? I don't know. We're looking for the parameters of our love in that question, who is my neighbor? And notice Jesus doesn't give a direct answer. Instead, he tells a story. And this story, the story of the Good Samaritan that we know so well, captures something of the extremes and hyperbole Jesus uses to get a message through to his listeners, and from which I hope we can draw a couple of points regarding the wider expanse of this practice of service. We know that story in Luke 10 of the Good Samaritan probably suffering from old over-familiarity issues like a lot of Jesus' stories. A man is on his way from Jericho to Jerusalem on a notoriously dangerous road. He is taken over by some bandits, some brigands who beat him up and beat him and leave him for dead. And while he's lying there on the side of the road, pretty much on death's door, along comes firstly a Jewish priest who sees the man and walks on by, as does a Levite, another part of the Jewish priestly setup. And that passing by, we might think, portrays these guys as the baddies. But there are probably lots of very good reasons why they would have done it, and probably good reasons we would have as well. Maybe it was too dangerous for them. They didn't want to have the same fate. They were on their way to do something on their agenda, maybe something even religious to do with their role. The man himself might be a Samaritan or worse, and he might be dead, and that would make me unclean, unable to do what I've been called to do. It'll probably be a hassle. It'll be costly, time, effort, maybe even money. Anyway, if you think about it, he probably brought it on himself. He probably deserved what he got. This is justice. And besides which, it's not my job, responsibility, or duty. Do any of those reasons, rationales, and excuses sound familiar? Because I think they seem very legitimate ways of preventing us getting involved with someone who needs that practice of service, someone who's in need, and therefore we use it as a reason to avoid. There is evidence from infant children's interactions that humanity is pre-wired for empathy and sympathy towards the suffering of another. Just notice the contagious crying in nurseries when one infant starts crying. But it seems that we grow out of this as we get older. Seeing a person in distress and then walking on by becomes more commonplace. And whilst Jesus would point that out as evidence of a lack of spiritual formation, that passing on by is actually something towards some sense of human deformation, losing that God-shaped instinct within us. So along in the story comes a Samaritan, someone viewed by Jesus' listeners as a despised ethnic half-breed heretic. And how despised the Samaritans were to the Jews, we only scrape the surface of it. And the feeling was mutual. We really don't get how controversial this story would have been to Jesus' listeners. He's really packing a punch here. And it says in verse 33, but a Samaritan, as he travelled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him, and he went to him. And that's the first thing. He didn't have any other reason to stop and help this broken Jewish man. No duty, no religious obligation, the opposite of anything. And it wasn't a case of him placating a sense of shouldness or oughtness, or even a sense of assuaging guilt of what if I don't get involved. And I wonder how often our motives for helping and serving, of giving, are influenced by doing it to prevent a feeling of guilt or for a guilt over not doing anything. Instead, it says the Samaritan took pity on the man. And it's such a weak translation in many ways, because the Greek word is splagnitsomai, which is often translated as having pity or compassion, but it's much more visceral. It talks about a gut-wrenching pain in our very centers towards what we're seeing. And the question is, do we allow ourselves to feel this level of pity, of compassion, to be moved by the situations of others? And part of the challenge of this is the scale of need in our broken world and all the demands for our attention and our resources to all these crises. And it's led to what some commentators call compassion fatigue. Notice we are called to only do what we can and not what we can't. But we sing a frankly dangerous song lyric in one of our worship songs, and it's a song called Hosanna. And in the refrain, it calls for, break my heart for what breaks yours. And what a prayer to pray. Could we actually take it for our heart breaking for what God breaks? But this is the driver of service, not a shoulddness or a duty or a piety. Jesus' response, and one which we're pursuing and practicing the way of Jesus, is an instinctual one in response to what we see a need is. And it's also seen in that first line where it says, a Samaritan as he traveled. The Samaritan was on his way somewhere to do something else, and we don't know what. His schedule, his plans, his agenda were disrupted by coming across this beaten up stranger on the roadside. He allowed himself to be interrupted. And it's something which we see so often in Jesus' ministry. So many times in Jesus' stories and interactions in the Gospels, we see that Jesus encounters someone or a situation while he was whatever. And an example is just a couple of chapters earlier in Matthew's Gospel, in Matthew 20, where two blind men are calling out to Jesus. And Jesus stops and turns off his course of action to minister to these guys. And John Mark Comer writes in his book, he says that Jesus' ministry is largely one of responding to unexpected interruptions with divine compassion. So are we willing to let our agenda and plans to be disrupted by a situation or someone where we can be agents of God's deep compassion? Or perhaps our schedules are too packed or too busy. How much is helping or serving an individual, a person, worth? Is it worth our time, our inconvenience? Is it worth disturbing our plans and schedules, even if it also disturbs the schedule and plans of others? But perhaps we could build in that intentionality of interruption within our lives. Could we consider the margins in life to allow for the possibility of interruption, to respond to a need? Or are we just too busy? Are there too many people relying on us, jobs that need to be done? I remember once on the way to church a good number of years ago, Helen and I were driving down Rakes Road, and we came across a woman who'd crashed off her bike, and she was lying in the road and she was unconscious. And we had a choice to either just keep on driving because we needed to get down to church, or to stop. And we stopped in the end and we helped this lady. We phoned ahead and other provisions were made. And it reminds us that it reminded me so much that our schedules need to be interruptible for God's kingdom. Which is more worshipful, going and singing songs, or actually living in a way in which we live out the values of the person we're worshiping? We see this in the prophets. In Amos 5, God says, take away the noise of your songs, instead bring justice and mercy. We talked about it in Isaiah 58. It's not just fasting, it's about justice and reaching out to the poor. And in 1 Samuel it says, to obey is better than sacrifice. The Samaritan man, and in each of Jesus' interruptions, the person in need was noticed. And often it is in the context of them being overlooked by others, even when those others are Jesus followers with really good reasons for continuing on their path. Someone once said that the Good Samaritan didn't just have good intentions, he also had a wallet, because service costs. Something needed to be done in this situation, and the Samaritan, he had the capacity and the capability to assist. He chose to enter into the situation of the beaten up man to help carry the burden that he had. He shared what he had and what he could for the benefit of another. And the massive punchline is that it's a Samaritan doing this to a Jew, someone who quite possibly in different circumstances would have treated the Samaritan man with derision and exclusion, and the Samaritan would have known this. But instead, this extreme picture Jesus paints is one which conveys this message in a really powerful way. The characters are extremes. The best Jews, the worst beating up, the most hated and therefore unlikely hero. And the extremes of what this hero does: he stops, he tends, he puts on his own donkey and he walks. He enters into a place of inconvenience and discomfort. He pays for the help the man needed over and above what you maybe would have expected. And Jesus is showing with a sledgehammer for a walnut how the Samaritan entered into the victim's situation and helped carry the burden with what he could. He held his dowry lightly and his wallet and resources lightly too. He was driven by the instinctual compassion with a willingness to count the cost. Because we said serving costs in some way to the server. And the challenge is this: are we willing to hold our resources lightly in service of God and others? Because the Samaritan goes further than expected by even a good Jew. He doesn't carry the man, take him to an inn and pay up and then go. That would be great in and of itself, inspiring, but he promises to come back. And this speaks of an ongoing involvement, because the broken man abandoned on that Jericho-Jerusalem road was, for the Samaritan, a person and not a project. And this is significant in terms of the practice of service. It's not really about our actions, it's about the person behind that. Another story Jesus tells to illustrate that, it's a bit of a weird one. It's in Luke 16, and it's a story of the rich man and Lazarus. And to recap, the rich man lives in luxury in purple, and he lives in this house, and there's a begging leper at his gate who would get the excess food from the rich man. And they both die, and the beggar goes to be with Father Abraham in heaven, and the rich man goes to Hades, the dark world of punishment. And he looks up to the beggar now in heaven and asks for mercy, and asks for Abraham to send the beggar to his 5 brothers to warn them of his fate. Seems very Christmas carol-y, doesn't it? And there's loads we could unpack within this story, but one really significant part for our theme today is that over the 40 plus parables and stories that Jesus tells in the Gospels, this is the only one where Jesus gives a character a name. And what a name! He gives him Lazarus, a name of one of his close friends, and one which has its roots in the word Eleazar, which means my God is my help. This leprous beggar has a name. He is a person with a family background, a story to tell, hopes and dreams which may have been shattered, fears and failures which may have perhaps been realized. He is a person, not a project. This became a real point when we engage with Renew Wellbeing, and the principles behind Renew Wellbeing is that it's a place where a person is known by their name and not their condition or situation. And that's so, so important. There is a sense of dehumanizing today of people, which happens whilst you're a number, you're a condition, you're a situation, you're an issue which needs to be addressed, you're a file which needs to be looked at. And Jesus names the nameless. And this was really evidenced to me, this picture, by a friend of mine called Mark, who was working for us at SBC a number of years ago as an intern. He came and lived and worked at SBC and lived in Skipton. And he'd hardly been here any time at all when he was talking to me about this guy called, let's say, Steve, that he'd met in Skipton. And it took me a while to realize that the guy he was speaking about, this Steve, was the seller of the big issue. I'd lived for such a long time in Skipton and I didn't know who he was talking about, to my shame. And Mark would be the sort of guy who wouldn't just buy the big issue. He would actually sit on the floor with the guy and get to know and chat with this guy, Steve. He knew his story, his background, his struggles. And I genuinely mean this when I say that how I have interacted with people on streets and situations like that since then has been different. I confess, not always. But when I engage, I'm inspired to ask their name, ask what they need and what I can do. And Mark was doing this just by instinct. And it reminded me that the big issue seller wasn't the big issue seller. He was Steve, who happened to be at this time, due to situations, homeless. And he was trying to put his life back together again by selling the big issue. He was not the big issue seller. He was Steve. Jesus names and knows the nameless. And we sing a song, don't we, with, we call it a children's song, but how profound. We say, I am not forgotten. I am not forgotten. God knows my name. Great song, deeply profound words, but how much more profound is it when we show by our serving towards others and how we treat them that we say, you are not forgotten. You are not forgotten. God knows your name. And it's interesting to note that the rich man, who's often depicted as the villain of this piece, but he actually does help alleviate the man's situation. He allows him to be at his gate, not necessarily something to be presumed, to have some semblance of shelter and safety. He lets him have the excess food from his presumably sumptuous larder, but he helps an anonymous poor man at a distance. He doesn't help Lazarus, the person. And this sin that he is in Hades for is not injustice. It's relational distance. He served at a distance. He did a good thing, but he didn't involve himself with the person. He threw crusts at him which fed him, but he didn't break bread with him. He didn't include him into his world. And it's a salient reminder to us, for those that we serve, we do so not because they are projects to work on or problems to solve. They are not pieties to practice on. They are people, individuals with names and families, stories and struggles, favorite foods and disliked music styles. They are known and they are loved and they are of inherent worth to God. And whilst our selfish brokenness can prevent us from seeing others that way and from serving them in a dehumanizing way, it can also dehumanize us in the eroding of God's image within us. And our intentional apprenticing to Jesus is our part in regaining that image of God within us. Mutual serving, reminding us that we are of worth in the sight of God and that others are the same. Hence why we serve others and are served in turn. You see, isolated acts of goodness and kindness are good, absolutely, but they are the starting point, not the final destination. So service is that following compassion, surrendering our plans and expectations. Service is what goes on unseen in hidden places. Service befriends those perhaps we would have thought that we have nothing in contact with or nothing in common. Service that in love embraces the cost to ourselves. And we may feel more comfortable with Jesus giving us directives, clear parameters of what to do, when to do it, and to whom. But it doesn't reveal as much of a desire to know. I think it reveals that desire to know what's the basic minimum, our shouldness. Remember, Jesus doesn't give the man who asks him or us a direct answer for what we're wanting. Instead, he paints that verbal picture within a story which communicates so much more and makes the challenge much, much deeper. Because the practice of service is less about actions and much more about attitude. The desire to be an apprentice to Jesus, as we've been looking at, has that overlapping order of be with Jesus, become like him, do as he did. And we could focus on that final stage, the doing as he did, and we'd be missing the point which actually transforms us. Because when it comes to loving our neighbour in our homes, our church, on the road between Jericho and Jerusalem or our equivalent, when it comes to the practice of service, what Jesus is looking for in us is not a checklist of deeds done or actions achieved, but of a growing instinct to respond to life situations, actually to people as he would, stemming from that intentionality to be like him and therefore to also do like him too.